The truth is, Decca wasn't actually that stupid. The phrase groups of 4 guitarists are on the way out was not the real reason they turned the Beatles down. Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, was desperately searching for a record deal in London. Most labels didn't even bother to see the group in person, they rejected them outright. That's what I call truly short-sighted. Decca, however, took them seriously. A&R man Mike Smith actually traveled to Liverpool on December 13, 1961, to see the Beatles play at the Cavern Club. Of course, part of the reason was that Epstein's NEMS company was one of Decca's most important clients. He couldn't just ignore him. Mike Smith then invited the Beatles to London for a test session at Decca's studios on January 1, 1962. For the Beatles, who had only played Liverpool clubs like the Cavern, this was their very first audition for a major label. Naturally, they were nervous. To make things worse, their road manager Neil Aspinall drove them overnight from Liverpool to London but got lost. The trip took 10 hours, and they didn't arrive until 10 p.m. the night before. The next morning at 10 a.m., they had to perform the audition, completely exhausted. Even though they weren't at their best, the band and Brian Epstein still felt confident that they would get the deal. Why? Because Mike Smith had come all the way to Liverpool to see them, and because the Beatles recorded an incredible 15 songs that day when most test sessions usually involved only 5. All the signs pointed to success. So, was Decca's reason for rejecting the Beatles really that groups of 4 guitarists are on the way out? This story comes from Brian Epstein's autobiography A Cellarful of Noise. But as I mentioned before, that book takes some liberties with the truth for the sake of drama. Decca's head of A&R at the time, Dick Rowe, denied until his death in 1986 that he ever said those words, and he has a strong case. Why? Because Decca did sign another guitar group that very same day, Brian Poole and the Tremeloes. The real reason was much more practical. Decca could only afford to sign one band, and since the Tremeloes were from Dagenham, right near London, they were cheaper and easier to work with than a band based in Liverpool. On top of that, the Tremeloes already had regular BBC radio appearances and a solid fanbase. From Decca's point of view, they were the safer bet. Honestly, given the circumstances, most labels would have made the same choice. Fun fact, Brian Epstein was so desperate that even after the rejection, he offered to buy 3,000 copies of any Beatles single if Decca would sign them. But Dick Rowe never knew about this promise. Later, Rowe admitted, if I had known they could sell 3,000 records, I would have signed them immediately. Imagine how history would have changed. No George Martin, no Abbey Road, maybe no Ringo joining the band. There's also another story about Dick Rowe. Sometime later, he traveled alone to Liverpool to see the Beatles again. That night it was pouring rain, and when he arrived at the Cavern Club, the place was so packed that he couldn't even get inside. So he stood outside, drenched in the rain, frustrated, and eventually left. Later he admitted how foolish that was, because the very fact that the club was too full to enter proved just how popular the Beatles already were. Even though the Beatles failed the audition, Brian Epstein asked for a copy of the tape. That tape turned out to be a blessing. He took it to HMV's Oxford Street store, where the manager suggested turning the reel-to-reel tape into discs. There, an engineer named Jim Foy was impressed by the recordings, especially when he learned that several songs were original Lennon-McCartney compositions. He connected Epstein with Sid Coleman of EMI's publishing arm, Ardmore and Beechwood. Coleman liked the songs, but Epstein insisted he wanted a recording contract, not just a publishing deal. So Coleman arranged a meeting with George Martin at Parlophone. Martin listened to the Decca tape, and the rest is history. He invited the Beatles to Abbey Road. Without the failed Decca audition, there might never have been the Beatles as we know them. Of course, after realizing their mistake, Decca quickly signed other major acts. Them, the Moody Blues, the Zombies, John Mayall's Bluesbreakers, the Small Faces, and thanks to George Harrison's recommendation, the Rolling Stones. Not a bad recovery, right? That's how Decca's rejection, often called the biggest mistake in pop music history, actually became the turning point that led the Beatles to George Martin and changed pop music forever.